American Politics Today, Chapter 6, Part 2. What Americans think about politics. American public opinion encompasses what people think of the federal government and their ideological beliefs. These opinions drive overall support for government action and serve as the basis for opinions on more specific policy questions. To understand what America's national government does and why we have to determine what Americans ask of it. Ideological polarization. We begin by examining liberal and conservative ideology and party identification to see if historical data show evidence of ideological polarization. Sharp difference in Americans' overall ideas of the size and scope of government. The What Do the Facts Say feature shows two kinds of survey data that can help us evaluate levels of polarization. Responses to a question measuring ideology, liberal, moderate, or conservative, and a question that taps a respondent's party identification, Republican, Independent, or Democrat. The ideological data show no evidence of increased polarization. In the case of partisanship, a substantial percentage of Americans in 2019 described themselves as independents. For more details on partisanship, see Chapter 7. Look more closely at opinion polarization. The third part of the What Do They Facts Say feature divides the electorate into 9 groups based on answers to questions that tap important principles from foreign policy to domestic issues, civil liberties, and morality. Principles such as these are a kind of consideration. They form the basis for opinions that people express in surveys or act on when they vote or engage in other political behavior. The figures show, first, that only about 1/5 of the electorate, solid liberals and country first conservatives, hold consistent ideological beliefs, meaning that they generally give one kind of answer, conservative or liberal. When asked questions that tap the underlying principles, moreover, most people fall into the intermediate groups, meaning that they express a mix of liberal and conservative issue positions. It's also important to remember that typologies like these are designed to identify differences and disagreements. There are many other issues on which there is a consensus among the American public. While these data confirm that Americans disagree on important policy questions, they argue against the conception of polarized America, with a large group of secular liberals opposing another large group of religious conservatives, and few people in the middle. Public opinion is much more complex. Most people could be labeled as liberals or as conservatives, secular or religious, depending on which issues they are asked about. Thus, even though people say they are liberals or conservatives, this response does not mean that they hold liberal or conservative preferences on all issues. In addition, self-professed moderates may hold relatively extreme preferences on certain policy questions. Thus, understanding what Americans think and what they want from government often requires data on specific policy questions rather than broad judgments about the liberal or conservative nature of American public opinion. Whether elected officials themselves are more polarized than their constituents is a different story. We will discuss in Chapter 10. Given this data, why do political scientists talk so much about high levels of polarization in contemporary America? For the most part, these comments refer to the fact that in contemporary American politics, most of the policy conflicts divide Americans along party lines. These disagreements are magnified by a phenomenon known as negative partisanship, which we discuss in Chapter 7. So, the difference between America now and a generation ago is not that we disagree more, but that most of our disagreements have Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. As we have already discussed, presidential approval and beliefs about the state of the economy are highly correlated with partisanship. In Chapter 8, we will show how partisanship drives voter decisions. Data presented throughout this book show partisan and ideological differences on many other political questions. In addition, the opinion data presented in other chapters show sharp partisan and ideological differences on questions about specific public policies. Finally, these partisan differences translate into higher levels of distrust by partisans from one party toward politicians and citizens from the other. Here's the graph. What do the facts say? Evaluations of government and office holders. Another set of politically significant opinions addresses how people view the government, how well or poor they think it's doing, whether they trust it, and their evaluations of individual politicians. These opinions matter for several reasons. Citizen judgments about the government's overall performance may shape their evaluations of specific policies, especially if they do not know how much about the policies. Evaluations of specific policies may be shaped how much a citizen trusts the government. Greater trust brings more positive evaluations. Trust in government and overall evaluations of it might influence a citizen's willingness to vote for incumbent congressional representatives or a president seeking re-election. The top graph in Figure 6.3 reveals that the average American fairly disenchanted with the government. As of 2019, a majority believes that government is not run for the benefit of all people, and that government programs are usually wasteful and inefficient. These beliefs have not changed much over the last generation, nor in light of COVID-19. This impression of disenchanted or disapproving public is reinforced by the second graph, which generally shows declining levels of trust in government. In the 1960s, many scholars have argued that low levels of trust make it harder for elected officials to enact new policies, especially those involving large expenditures. Some scholars even argue that low levels of trust raise questions about the future of democracy in America. How can we say that American democracy is good for or popular form of government when so many people are unhappy with the performance of elected officials and bureaucrats, and so few people trust the government? Finally, trust in government also has a partisan cast. People are more likely to express trust in the government when someone from their party is serving as president. One important insight is that although Americans don't like the government, in general, they tend to be more satisfied with their own representatives in Washington. See Chapter 10. For example, a survey question asking about the government may cause respondents to picture a roomful of bureaucrats pushing paperwork, whereas a question asking about your representative may lead respondents to think of someone working on their behalf. Also, as we discuss in Chapter 10, Members of Congress work hard to convince their constituents that they are doing everything possible to satisfy constituents' demands. Sometimes members blame the institution of Congress and the government bureaucracy for shortcomings, portraying themselves as standing between their constituents and an inefficient government. Policy preferences. In a diverse country of more than 330 million people, care about a wide range of policies. One useful measure of Americans' policy preferences is the policy mood, which captures the public collective demands for government action on domestic policies. Policy mood measures are constructed from surveys that address a wide range of policy questions. Fluctuations in the policy mood in America have led to changes in defense spending, environmental policy, and civil rights, among others, and have influenced elections. Figure 6.4 shows that when the policy mood leans in an activist direction, Americans want governments to do more, corresponding to lower values on the vertical axis, such as in the early 1960s. Conditions are ripe for an expansion of the federal government involving more spending and new programs. But when the policy moods leans in the opposite directions, Americans want a smaller, less active government corresponding to higher values on the vertical axis. Elected officials generally enact smaller increases in government spending and fewer new programs, or as in recent elections, candidates who support a more active government are more likely to be defeated. At present, support for an activist government at its highest since Barack Obama's administration. Given these opinions, we should expect expansion in the size and scope of the government, or at least until public policy mood moves in a less activist direction. I'm going to go ahead and show you figure 6.3 and the graphs. Policy mood, and there's that. Regarding more specific policy preferences, everything we have said in this chapter reinforces the idea of public opinion is often a moving target. While some beliefs and preferences are stable over time, opinions about specific policies can change from year to year, month to month, or even day to day. One of the best ways to take a snapshot of these beliefs is to ask citizens what they see as the top policy priorities facing the nation. Figure 6.5 shows responses to a 2019 survey, which of course does not reflect opinions in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic or the Black Lives Matter protest of 2020. Top priorities: the economy, education, and healthcare have not changed very much over the last several decades. It is no exaggeration to say Americans are always worried about the economy, even when other pressing issues such as terrorism surpass the economy as the most important problems. To Americans, the economy is typically listed second or third. In general, as the state of the economy declines, more and more people rate the economy as their greatest concern. Moreover, the percentage of people who mention their personal economic concerns, for example, unemployment or worries about retirement, also increases. One important change in recent years is that concern about terrorism and international conflict are no longer at the top of the list. In the wake of September 11th attacks and the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, many Americans saw protecting the country against attacks as the top priority. Now, even though U.S. forces are still engaged in fighting groups such as Al Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, Americans see fighting terrorism as less of a priority than domestic policy issues. These policy priorities frame contemporary political debates and divide the political parties. Think about what Republicans and Democrats in Washington argue about: how best to fight terrorism and secure the United States from attack, how to increase economic growth and reduce the unemployment rate, and what the government's role should be in providing health care and making sure that Americans have secure retirements. In fact, there are sharp partisan disagreement on many of these issues. 67% of Democrats see climate change as an important problem, while only 21% of Republicans give the same response when asked about their public policy priorities. Similar differences exist for economic inequality, racism, and illegal immigration. However, in other areas such as concerns over jobs and Social Security responses do not vary much by party. The list of priorities in Figure 6.5 also explains government inaction on some issues. For example, gun control doesn't even appear on the list. Thus, the fact that Congress has not legislated on the issue in recent years is actually consistent with public opinion. For better or for worse, the average American has other priorities for government action. Here is Figure 6.5 and the graph. Here is the little cartoon. Does public opinion matter? We can say with confidence that public opinion remains highly relevant in American politics today. One key piece of evidence is the amount of time and effort politicians, journalists, and political scientists spend trying to find out what Americans think. Of course, it is easy to find examples like gun control, in which policy has stayed the same despite a majority supporting change. In other words, such as the enactment of Obamacare, new policies have been passed even through a majority preferred the status quo at the time of enactment. But these examples do not mean that public opinion is irrelevant. It is not always possible to please a majority of citizens. Politicians' willingness to do so depends on whether the majority is organized to interest groups, how much they care about the issue, and the intensity of the opposition, and most important, the details of their personal preferences and the views held by their constituents. More broadly, public opinion exerts a conspicuous influence in widespread areas of the government. We mention this broad influence repeatedly throughout this book. In Chapter 10, we describe how legislators endeavor to determine what their constituents want and how their constituents will respond to different actions. In Chapter 8, we see how voters use retrospective evaluations to form opinions about whom to vote for and how candidates incorporate the public's views into campaign platforms that will attract widespread support. And in Chapter 7, we discuss how voters use candidates' party affiliations like brand names to determine how candidates will behave if elected. Scholars have found that congressional actions on a wide range of issues, from votes on defense policy to the confirmation of Supreme Court nominees, are shaped by the constituent opinion. Moreover, careful analysis of the connection between opinions and actions shows that this linkage does not exist because politicians are able to shape public opinion in line with what they want to do. Rather, politicians behave in line with their constituents' opinions, because to do otherwise would place the politician in jeopardy of losing the next election. Recent events also speak to the influence of public opinion. Think about the failure of elected officials over the last few years to repeal Obamacare, enact immigration reform, or pass new limits on the ownership of handguns and assault rifles. In all of these cases, a significant portion of American wanted policy change, but a substantial percentage were opposed, and even supporters disagreed on what kinds of change were best. Congressional inaction on these measures does not reflect a willful ignorance of public opinion. Rather, it reflects the lack of a public consensus about what government should do. Inaction on these issues is exactly what we should expect if public opinion is real and relevant to what happens in politics. The news media. Closely related to our discussion of public opinion is the role of the news media for its generally through the media that Americans receive political information. This section describes the mass media, the many sources of political information available to Americans, and how people use or don't use this information. Finally, we consider how the media may influence public opinion and politics. The media is the first example in this book of a linking institution or an actor or group of actors in American politics that informs citizens about government actions or helps them exercise control over policy. The development of the internet over the last generation has dramatically increased the number of media sources and the ranges of information available to the average American. The changing media landscape means that it is less important than it was in the past to describe each media source and what kinds of information it can and cannot provide. In contemporary America, there is so many sources and so much information that Americans can become experts on virtually any aspect of politics or public policy. If they are willing to search for information and assess the values of what they find. Media sources in the 21st century. Over the last 2 decades, the internet has become a major source, or a major and often dominant source for information about American politics. Virtually all U.S. newspapers, television networks, radio stations, and cable stations offer free or increasingly paid access to most or all of their content via websites and mobile apps, as well as providing some web-only information. Many internet-only sites offer a combination of rumor, inside information, and deep analysis of American politics. Some, such as Politico, Vox, and 538, have paid staff and report on a wide range of topics. Others have a narrower focus. The Monkey Cage, now affiliated with the Washington Post, and the Mischiefs of Faction, use political science research to explain contemporary American politics, and many websites, some run by ordinary citizens, provide their own insights and information about American politics. Finally, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media sites provide users with links to coverage written by others. People also use these sites to report and comment on political events themselves. These changes have dramatically increased the amount of information about politics that is available to the average American. Imagine yourself in the late 1940s. Suppose you wanted to learn about President Truman's State of the Union address. If you couldn't go to Washington to hear it in person, where could you have gotten information about the speech? If you lived in a big city, the speech would probably be covered in the next day's newspaper. If you lived in a small town, your local paper might or might not even run the story. If it didn't, you would need a subscription to either a big city paper, which would arrive a week after the fact, or a weekly or monthly news magazine. Or you would need to have access to a radio that could pick up a station broadcasting the speech. Now consider the modern era in which major political events saturate the media and a virtually unlimited amount of information is available on the internet. Suppose you want to know about the President's State of the Union message. You can tune into one of the 4 major television networks, numerous cable news channels, public television stations, or radio stations. Most television stations will feature pundits, commentaries on the speech, and will interview prominent politicians and commentators. Jimmy Fallon and other late night hosts will probably make jokes about it on television, and John Oliver will skewer the speech on his Sunday show. Tomorrow it will be front page news, and larger papers will publish the full text of the speech online. Countless websites will offer analysis, and you will be able to watch a video of the speech on YouTube and many other sites. Some of your friends, perhaps even you, might offer commentary on social media. The point is, there are many places to get information. You would have to work to avoid them. The internet creates new opportunities for interaction between citizens, reporters, and government officials. Many reporters host live chat sessions, allowing people to ask follow-up questions about published stories or interact with their audience through a variety of social media sites. People who know something about political events, or think they do, now have a variety of ways, from blogs to Twitter, to contribute to the commentary on political news stories and put information before a wide audience. While there is much more information available today than there was a generation ago, media sources are constantly in flux. Websites and web pages come and go. Individuals who post a detailed analysis of one political event may be too busy to comment on another. Even well-established media sources can quickly change. For example, in recent years, companies that once owned newspapers in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Minneapolis have gone bankrupt, whereas several major U.S. cities, including Seattle, Birmingham, and New Orleans, have a hometown daily newspaper that appears only in digital form. Other new newspapers have cut foreign bureaus, reduced their staff, and thinned the amount of news in every edition. One exception is the Washington Post, which expanded its newsroom by over a third under the ownership of Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. At the same time, the major television network, as well as the cable television sources, have seen declines in viewership. The increase in sources has also led to a blurring of fact and opinion in some news coverage. Most mainstream media distinguish between news coverage, where the goal is to present facts and analysis without an ideological agenda, and opinion pieces, which have a clear point of view. In print media, the latter stories are usually reserved for a special opinions and editorial section. Newer media sources, especially solo web-only operations, may not follow these conventions, meaning that casual readers might assume they are reading factual account when in fact they are not. See what they do, the facts say feature for an example of this. Here is Feel free to pause this to read this. And here is the graph. There you go. Regulating the media. Federal regulation of the news media was driven by the fact that many media sources are profit-seeking businesses, as well as concerns over the media's potential to shape public opinion. For example, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, regulates broadcast media, such as radio stations, as well as broadcast and cable television. Limits on ownership and content. Until the very recently, a central concern of the FCC was that one company or organization might buy enough stations to dominate the airwaves in an area and become a monopoly, offering only one set of programs or point of view. For many years, FCC regulations limited number of radio and television stations a company could own in a community and the total nationwide audience that a company's television stations could reach. The FCC also created the equal time provision, which states that if a radio or television station gives airtime to a candidate outside its news coverage, such as during an entertainment show, it has to give an equivalent amount of time to other candidates running for the same office. In addition, it established a fairness doctrine whereby broadcasters had to present opposing points of view as part of their coverage of important events. Usually this was done by broadcasting editorials during news programs that presented both sides of an issue. Deregulation. The FCC's limits on ownership and content, as well as fairness doctrine, have been eliminated because of the development of new communication technology. The logic is that with so many sources of information, if one broadcaster ignores a candidate, an issue, or a viewpoint, citizens can still find what they want from another source. Pressure for deregulation also came from the owners of the media companies who wanted to buy more television, radio, and cable stations, as well as from book and magazine publishers, internet service providers, and newspapers. These regulatory changes have shaped the current media landscape into two ways. First, they have allowed for concentration. Many media companies own multiple media sources in a town or community. For example, iHeartMedia owns over 850 AM and FM radio stations, including multiple stations in more than 30 cities. Similarly, Facebook, which is a major source of news for many Americans, also own Instagram. Second, the changes have allowed for cross-ownership, in which one company owns several different kinds of media outlets, often in the same community. For example, Nexstar owns various Chicago media outlets, including WGN Radio, the WGN television station, and the Chicago Tribune daily newspaper. These trends have given rise to a media conglomerates, companies that control a wide range of news sources. Nuts and Bolts 6.2 shows the diverse holdings of one such company, the Walt Disney Company. You may think of Disney in terms of theme parks, cruises, and Avengers or Star Wars movies and TV shows, but the company owns a wide range of media companies, including the ABC Broadcast Network, Hulu, ESPN, and political information site 538. Here's Nuts and Bolts. Media effects on citizens and government. The study of media effects explores whether exposure to media coverages of politics changes what people think or do. There is considerable evidence that media coverage influences its audience. In simple terms, much of what Americans know about politics comes from the stories they read, watch, or listen to. In part, these effects arise because people exposed to stories that describe a particular event learn new facts as a result of their exposure. However, some of the impact of the media coverage stems not from what such stories contain, but from how they present certain information, even whether a story is reported at all. Many studies have found that exposure to political coverage changes what citizens know. At the most basic level, people who watch, read, or listen to more coverage about politics know more than people who are exposed to less of this coverage. What people learn from the media can shape the demand they place on politicians. However, at least part of the media's effect on people's knowledge level arises because of underlying interest. People who are interested in politics know more in the first place, and because of their interest, watch more media coverage of events as they happen. Moreover, because people can pick and choose which coverage to watch, read, or listen to, what they learn from the media tends to reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. That is, a conservative might listen to Sean Hannity while a liberal might watch MSNBC. Both people may learn something from the coverage, but the most likely result is that they will only grow more certain in the opinion that they already have. Given this evidence of media effects, one of the central questions is whether reporters and editors have a discernible bias. That is, do their decisions about which events to report and how they report on them reflect a conscious effort to shape public opinion in liberal, conservative, or other direction. Surveys of the American electorate have found a hostile media effect, regardless of respondents' partisan leaning. They believe that the media favor candidates and ideas from the other party. It is easy to find examples of suspicious decisions by reporters and their editors that suggest some sort of overt bias in coverage. And many journalists and commentators admit that they take an ideological or partisan perspective. It is also no surprise that politicians complain that media coverage is biased against them. The stakes for them are very high. For example, during the final weeks of the 2020 election, Donald Trump's campaign wanted more coverage of claims that Joe Biden was corrupt politician whose son and other family members had used connections to enrich themselves, and less attention paid to the COVID-19 pandemic and the weak American economy. The Biden campaign, in turn, complained that the media coverage were focusing too much on rumors about Biden's health or conflicts within the Democratic Party, and not enough on Trump's missteps. Thus, while both campaigns complained about bias, the simple explanation for their complaints is that they wanted to win the election and therefore wanted media coverage that exposed their opponent's flaws rather than the candidate's flaws. In fact, while it is easy to find media coverage of politics that is incomplete or sloppily reported, cases in which reporters made predictions that latter turned out to be false, or stories that candidates wish had not been reported, it is hard to find cases of systematic bias in media coverage. Moreover, while some academic studies have found evidence of press coverage favoring one type of candidate or issue position over another, An equally large body of work has produced important critiques of these studies. For one thing, a finding that most reporters are liberal or Democrats and few are conservative Republicans does not imply that political coverage must necessarily favor liberal positions or Democratic candidates. Reporters may prioritize being as objective as possible, fear that favoring one side will cause their audience to decline, or be subject to review by editors who are on guard against bias. Similarly, the fact that a reporter criticizes a politician or party is not evidence of his or her lack of objectivity. Critiques do not in themselves suggest that reporters is being unfair. The question is, what would be a fair analysis look like? Many analyses of President Trump's time in office before COVID-19 acknowledged the strong American economy, but gave little credit to Trump for this outcome. Were these reporters biased against Trump, or had they read the literature on political control of the economy, which shows that presidential actions have little impact on economic conditions, particularly in the short run? Untangling these effects is difficult, and if media bias were as pronounced as some critics claim, it would be likely easier to measure. Filtering and framing. Compared with overt bias, filtering and framing may produce subtler but stronger impacts on public opinion. Filtering, also called agenda setting, refers to the ways in which journalists and editors' decisions about which stories to report influence which stories people think about. Framing refers to how the description or presentation of a story, including the details, explanation, and context, changes the ways people react to and interpret the information. Space limitations mean that some filtering is inevitable. As reporter and editors decide which of many potential news stories to cover, similar decisions about what to report and how to present the information led to the framing effects. Even if everyone in the political media adhered to the highest standard of accuracy, these influences would still exist. Unpacking the conflict. Consider all that we've discussed in this chapter. Let's apply what we know about how public opinion works to the examples from the beginning of the chapter. Do Americans really hold bizarre beliefs that are sometimes expressed in polling results? Can we take polls seriously if they produce results like these? Where does public opinion come from? Can politicians trust public opinion as a guide to what Americans want? And can we use opinions to measure the quality of American democracy? Given how people form opinions, it's easy to see what Jon Stewart was talking about. At least some of the time, public opinion will be incomplete at best and widely inaccurate at worst. But that's not surprising. For most people, politics is the most important thing in their lives, and they don't spend much time worrying about it, learning the details, or forming judgments until they need to. This logic also explains why people are sometimes unable to answer seemingly easy questions, as in the survey mentioned alongside the image at the beginning of this chapter, in which respondents were asked to find Iran on a map of the Middle East. Most of the time, there's no reason to know where Iran is. Even if the United States and Iran came close to armed conflict, as they did in early 2020, it is unclear whether knowledge of geology would help average citizens decide how they felt about the matter. When we ask how good opinions are or whether the electorate acts, rationality rationally and responsibly, as V.O. Key argued. The most important thing to remember is that there is no absolute standard of accuracy. One of the fundamental tenets of a democracy is that people are free to hold whatever opinions they want and to base these opinions on whatever factors they want to consider. If someone says she approves of Trump's performance in office, and we determine that her judgment is based on Trump's being a Republican, this opinion is as legitimate as that of someone whose evaluation is based on a detailed study of multiple factors. Moreover, making sense of politics requires people to make some pretty sophisticated judgments, and it would be no surprise to find that they make mistakes some of the time, particularly given the shortcuts they use to form their opinions. Nevertheless, the model of opinion formation described in this chapter provides observers of American politics with a guide for interpreting public opinion, including how opinions will change given events. These findings also explain why proliferation of media sources and the rise of social media has not produced a better informed public. Even now, the fact that much more information is available has not changed our consumption habits. The value of gathering additional information is simply not worth the trouble, especially given the need to reconcile different sources. In addition, people today have a better sense of which sources they should trust and which they shouldn't. Taken as a group, the media are no less trustworthy than they were a generation ago. But the average American has a much better way of why they should be suspicious of some media coverage. Should we take polls seriously? Yes, but not too much. Given all the potential problems with mass surveys, we should suspicious about surprising results, such as the support for conspiracy theories cited at the beginning of this chapter. Respondents may not have taken the question seriously. They may have focused on subtle details of the question, or their reply may have been driven by considerations that have nothing to do with the question at hand. Republican suspicions about Barack Obama's citizenship probably reflected the fact that several of their party leaders, as well as prominent spokespeople, including Donald Trump, had repeatedly voiced their suspicions during the campaign, and Democratic concerns about the government foreknowledge of the September 11th attacks were colored by the identity of the president at the time. Republican George W. Bush, more generally, we should take poll results seriously to the extent that they are based on multiple surveys, with differently worded question, are conducted by reputable pollsters and are conducted at a time when respondents are aware of the issues they are being asked about. One poll on its own doesn't tell us very much. In sum, while you can't take every poll result you see at face value, public opinion is real, and it matters. Americans have ideas about what they want government to do, and they use these ideas to guide their political choices. Polls showing deep disagreement between Americans on some issues describe the policy landscape on which election will be contested and the subsequent debates in Washington. While very few Americans are policy experts, their views on policy are the ultimate driver of our government's choices. This is the end of Chapter 6, Part 2.